Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this podcast. I am super excited to be sharing with you a series of episodes where I answer questions that I received from my Instagram community. So a few weeks ago, I did the whole sticker thingamajig, and I told people, I was like, hey, I'm going to go on the podcast. I'm going to create some solo episodes of just me answering your questions as best as I can. And specifically, I was soliciting questions about learning astrology, and I got so many juicy questions. At first, I thought it was going to be this casual thing, but no. So much flowed out of me, and I just kept, going and going. And I think if I were to compile all of these questions, they would be like 3 or 4 hours long, maybe a little bit more. So first of all, thank you for everyone who submitted the question, because I really love answering questions about learning astrology. If you love me answering questions about astrology, I would love to know, because maybe I'll do more of these episodes. It was just so fun to create. Just a reminder before we get into it that my course with Britton LaRue, Astrology as Praxis, will be starting on September 10th, 2022, and registration will be on August 26th to 28th. I'm super excited to not only be teaching astrology, but also to explore various pathways that you can use to integrate astrology, individually as well as in a community. Using astrology, yes, to help you understand yourself, right? That is definitely the point of this class. But also to expand your idea of who you are as a cosmic being and your role, your participation, your agency within this larger cosmic body. It's really a robust container, a beautiful, sturdy curriculum where we really actively invite in all of our faculties, right? Our mental, intellectual faculties, our emotional, spiritual, somatic faculties, to participate in learning and ultimately unlearning astrology and creating the astrology that we need and want in this moment. Check out our course page if this resonates. All of that will be in the show notes below. Okay, so back to the questions. Because they were all so rich, I really didn't want to fit this into 1 or 2 episodes, because I think that might be a little overwhelming given how the episodes have so many different topics. And so I'm trying a new format here where I'm going to break it up into many different smaller pieces. So you're going to see episode 26 to 31 being these Q&A episodes. Episode 26 is where I cover a couple questions. One of them is really about what to say or how to deal with naysayers of astrology. And then the other one was really about how do we reconcile being a unique individual, right, with unique birth charts, as well as being, categorizable using the language of astrology. And so to me, these 2 questions are a little bit more philosophical, and they really speak to like this duality of like the inner skeptic and the outer skeptic. So I grouped them together, and then episode 27 is my personal recommendations on learning astrology. So if you are interested in doing that and you think you will benefit from, a list of resources and me kind of reviewing those resources, listen to episode 27. Episode 28 is pretty technical. It's where I talk about houses, aspects, and stellium. I find that these 3 subjects are really the subjects that are for like advanced beginner astrology students are very much like alive, because we don't tend to talk about houses or aspects in like memes, so people don't really know about it that much. So if you feel ready to go into like the nitty-gritty of astrology, go to episode 28 for houses, aspects, stellium. And then episode 29 is where I talk a little bit about my current approach to interpreting natal chart, as well as where I stray from tradition. So this is an interesting episode. I think this one may be the more controversial one, if that's what you're into. Episode 30 is like my astrology ritual and practices, as well as a major life transit, which in this case, Pluto transiting through my very packed fifth house. So episode 29 and 30 are both a bit more on the personal side. Like they're really kind of my take on things. So if that's what you're interested in, or if you're interested in hearing my life story and my journey with Pluto, then definitely listen to episode 30. But both of them are pretty personal. And then episode 31 are really the miscellaneous questions that I couldn't really find a place for in the other episodes. They're really about Lionsgate and then housing contract and Chiron in Cancer. So yeah, I hope that you enjoy these episodes. Please also know that if you're listening to an episode where there are numerous questions, you can always skip ahead using the timestamps below in the show notes, right? So yeah, that hopefully will come in very handy, and you will find that very useful. If you are like, oh, I'm not really interested in this question, just jump ahead. And then finally, all of the intros are going to be the same for episodes 26 to 31. So you can, if this is your first time listening to the intro, well, you got to the end of it. And if this is your second episode that you're exploring, then totally just skip to the questions, right? Don't feel like you need to listen to the intro again. And you can use the timestamps for that. Okay, cool. That's me being my Virgo rising self, letting you know about all of the little details. And I think that's it. So enjoy this episode. Actually, more like this series of episodes that are super juicy, super exciting, pretty nerdy, and I will see you on the other side. So the next question came from two Bridgets, which I just really love. I mean, the synchronicity, the fact that two different Bridgets in my community are asking the same question blew my mind. So clearly I'm supposed to talk about this. Sometimes the house significations feel random and difficult to intuit. Any tips? And then the other question, anything houses related. How do you like to learn about them? What's your favorite? I think this question gets asked a lot because houses tend to be what astrology students seem to approach last. Signs usually get tackled first, right? Nowadays, you can't really even run away from them, especially if you are looking at memes on Instagram. There are so many memes about signs out there. And then I think planets feel pretty intuitive because once you have a good vibe for, what the signs are trying to tell us, then, beginning to connect that maybe with rulerships, with even just seeing like the similarities between different planets and different signs, right? It feels really easeful. It feels like a natural progression. Houses are still a mystery because nobody really writes about houses as memes yet. Maybe that's something I should do. Maybe I should write more about houses and create house memes. Or if any of you would like to, you should do that. I want to affirm first and foremost that learning about houses is not easy. My favorite text on the houses is Demetra George's Ancient Astrology, Volume 2. It is a very comprehensive read, But it's also, to me, Demetra George is always amazing because her books are really easy to read. At least I find it easy to read, even though it's very robust, very much rooted in, deep and extensive scholarship. Somehow, I think she does an incredibly and painstakingly good job at creating a very easy to refer to material. So, for example, in this text, right, she refers to the historical developments of the house significations using like really easy to use charts. So it's almost like you open the book. The book looks pretty thick, right? But you open it and you get to the houses section and it's extremely easy. She's made it extremely easy for people to do kind of a historical analysis or even get a sense of how the house significations have changed throughout the ages. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but I think that's part of the difficulty, right, in learning about the houses, because there has been so many changes over the years, over the millennia of how we see and interpret the houses. Without getting too deep into that yet, basically, I think what Demetra does here with creating the chart that shows you the significations from earlier sources to more modern astrological lineages is super helpful, right? You can really see the evolution. You can trace the method of thinking even. Another thing about Demetra's book that I think is great is that it's presented in like a workbook style. So you get to test out your information and kind of verify, even if you are not taking a course, right, related to a particular subject. So I think that's really great. I think the best thing I can do is to address this through sharing my own way of looking at the houses, to kind of give you a quick overall view of the houses, right? And this will take a while, but I hope that this will be something that's really valuable for you. And then maybe also address some other concerns that may come up that I feel is kind of the thing that animates the question, right? Like I'm also going to address what I feel is the question behind the question. So whenever I talk or think about houses, I always start with the angular houses, right? Which mean exactly what they sound like. Houses on the angles, right? So if you look at a circular birth chart, a birth chart that is represented in the shape of a circle, on your middle left is the first house, right? Where the ascendant is. And then on your middle right is the seventh house, where the descendant is. At the top of the chart is the 10th house. Sometimes it's where the midheaven or the MC is, not always. And at the bottom is the 4th house. Sometimes, not always, is where the IC is, right? Or the Imum Cheli. So let's orient here a little bit. The ascendant is on the 1st house, right? The 1st house, or the sign that's ruling the 1st house, is really the sign that was rising at the easternmost horizon when you were born. So you can kind of think about it as the sign that introduced you to this world, or the sign that you drew, right? The energy that you drew when you were taking your first breath. So that was the sign that was your rising. Your 1st house is your point of embodiment, right? It speaks to your body, your path in life, your temperament. And then opposite that, right, the descendant is where the 7th house is. It's really the sunset point, or where things set, right? It's also opposite graphically and conceptually from the self and the body, right? So what is opposite from the self? What is opposite from the self's body? We can maybe think of it as the other, right? It's where, and with whom we create one-on-one contracts, where we make commitments with another person, right? It can be a lover, it can be a business partner, it can be an enemy, right? Psychological astrology would also say that it's the part that we other within ourselves. And then at the top of the chart is the 10th house, right? So situated at the top, close to the noon point or the midheaven, it tends to be the 10th house is the most visible part of us, right? Or it's where we contribute to the world. It's our career, it's our public persona. It's where we kind of stick our head out and stand out in order to share something with the world, right? It's like where we perhaps literally can think of a figure like going up the stairs and then like, being on a stage, right? If you want to be on a stage, if you want to command people's attention, you have to kind of rise up, right? You have to be elevated in order for people to be able to see you. And then at the very bottom of the chart is the 4th house, right? Opposite the 10th house, or the top of the chart, or the highest point in the sky, is the belly of the earth, right? So you can kind of think of it as the belly of the chart as well. So the 4th house then signifies the home, right? The private life, the family that one comes from, our inner life, right? So a little recap. 1st house is a self. Opposite from the 1st house, the 7th house is the other, right? The counterpoint that the self is interacting with. And then at the bottom of the chart, the 4th house is the home life, and then the 10th house is the public life. So notice a pattern here, right? You can see that the house significations literally come in pairs. Now, I don't fully use the natural zodiac, right, which is in a lot of modern astrological lineages. The significations of the houses are conflated with the sign. So maybe 1st house is connected to Aries, 2nd house connected to Taurus, and so forth, right? However, I do think there is resonance between the working principle of the opposite signs and the opposite houses, right? So what I mean by that is we often learn the significations or the meanings of the sign by kind of contrasting them with the opposite sign. So for example, Aries is the warrior, Libra is a peacemaker, right? Scorpio goes into the underworld, Taurus is the height of the spring in the above world, and so forth, right? And so I think that way of or that template of working with the signs and understanding the signs in terms of polarities or polar energies, right? Polar opposites can be really helpful in understanding the houses. So really starting with that energy of opposition between the houses, right? So now our job gets a little bit easier because we can just talk about them in pairs. So I'm going to go through them one by one, and hopefully that helps. Okay, so 2nd house comes right after the 1st house. If you look at it graphically, right, so the houses are really counterclockwise. And if you look at the 2nd house being kind of, slightly below the 1st house graphically, it literally is like the 2nd house is supporting the 1st house, right? So what supports our bodies? What supports our existence in this world? The answer to that would be our resources, right? Both financial and other non-financial resources. The 2nd house is what we need to support our existence as a self, as a spirit in a human body within this world. Opposite the 2nd house is the 8th house, right? Graphically, you can see that the 8th house is kind of like coming out of the 7th house, right? It sprouts out from the 7th house. And so we can think of it in terms of its significations, right, as shared resources, as that which literally sprouts from the commitments that we create with others. 8th house also relates to death, to taxes, and if the 2nd house is what supports our existence, the 8th house is then what we need to give away, to surrender as a price of admission to our existence. That's kind of how I think about it. The 3rd house comes before the 4th house, right? And so if the 4th house is the private home, then the 3rd house is kind of what hugs the private home, right? It makes me think of the old adage, it takes a village to raise a child. Often the 3rd house is associated with local neighborhood within which the house, the private home, is nestled in, right? So what goes into the 3rd house is the local neighborhood stuff. It speaks about siblings, cousins, local associations, public libraries, right? In ancient astrology, it's the house of the goddess, the house of worship of the local goddess, right? It's where the moon finds its joy in the planetary joy scheme. So we can also think of it as like the ritual that wraps up around the private parts of self, right? The rituals that give meanings and also structure to the hidden heart of the chart, that is the fourth house. Opposite the third house is the ninth house, right? So the ninth house, if the third house is the local neighborhood, then the ninth house rules long distance travels, higher education, philosophies, astrology, right? It's about connecting to the beyond. That which is foreign, that which is macro and exciting, right? And feels like this adventure, this exploration. In ancient astrology, the ninth house is the house where the sun rejoices. So it has to do with where our spirit reigns, where our spirit is rejoicing, and where maybe we can leave our bodies a little bit, right? Where we can focus more on that conceptual idea of the self. Okay, moving on. The fifth house is where we leave the inner private parts of us, our home, right? If you look at it graphically, it's like right next to or to the right of the fourth house, right? It's where we leave the most private parts of us, metaphorically and literally, to find joy. I like to think of the fourth house to the fifth house journey as kind of maybe leaving one's own private home to begin expressing ourselves, right? It's like, some parts of us that from that private space of the fourth house, they might come with us. Some will stay hidden, but they're all expressed, whether in the conscious, transparent ways or kind of in the more covert, subconscious ways, into the fifth house, right? Traditionally, the fifth house is where Venus rejoices, right? And so thinking about Venus as the planet of love, of harmony, of fecundity, right? The significations of the fifth house around children, where Venus rules fertility, right? Or creative projects, which are really our creative children. And later also, the fifth house becomes associated with self-expression. And then opposite the fifth house is the 11th house, where one finds communities of people who share our hopes and dreams. Traditionally, this is really the house where Jupiter rejoices. Jupiter constellates within this area of life the people who not only will support us, right, but people who are attracted to us precisely because we express ourselves fully in the fifth house, precisely because we raise our freak flags, right? So if the fifth house is the authentic self-expression, then the 11th house is the authentic communal expression, is how I think about it. Finally, our last pair is the 6th house and the 12th house. So the 6th house is where we find ourselves laboring to support our livelihood. The 6th house rules the things we do because we need to do them, right? Maybe not necessarily out of pleasure, but really out of necessity. This is the house of daily work, of servitude. In the ancient world, slavery is kind of a common thing, right? If you fell into debt, and you can't pay back your debt, you may have to be a slave regardless of your skin color, your age, or your race. So this is the house where Mars rejoices in traditional astrology. And I like to think about it as akin to, someone who's a mercenary or like a paid contractor. They're not really doing things because it's going to be beneficial to them in the long term necessarily, right? It's not the things that they do to bring joy. And so if that's the case, these are the areas where we're not interested in kind of dilly-dallying and finding meaning, right? We just kind of want to do it fast and get it done and get out of there, right? Which is, to me, also very much related to Martian principles. And then opposite the 6th house is really the 12th house. And the 12th house is where we retreat, where we isolate, where we get lost, where things are hidden from plain sight, where, we kind of enter the womb-like space where things are being created, but it's not always totally clear to the naked eye how the process works, right? Or what the timeline even is. And so it's often correlated with prison, with isolation, with rehab, with mental institutions. It's also the house where Saturn rejoices, right? So hopefully that helps give you an idea of how to understand the houses as pairs. And that to me has been the most helpful way to really feel into the houses. So another thing I also introduced there is the planetary joy scheme. I find that the planetary joy scheme really helps me find a lot of understanding in the houses and the house significations. It may take a while to kind of let that sink in, right? From the first time that you saw it until you can begin incorporating it, especially if you're coming from more of a modern psychological perspective or the natural zodiac perspective. But honestly, I think all approaches are worth knowing and worth learning, if only to understand where things are coming from, right? So, even the natural zodiac that I mentioned earlier, that way of looking at the houses as being tied to the zodiac, right? I think can be a really helpful thing to learn as well, for reasons that I will speak about in a little bit. So now let me zoom out a little bit, right? So the reason why I said learning houses is not easy, it's because it's not only that the significations shift over time, that, the different things associated with certain houses shift over time, and depending on the kinds of astrology that's practiced, the main concerns of the people practicing the astrology, but also there's a shift in the underlying logic, right? With the introduction of the natural zodiac, in medical astrology, in the Renaissance period, for example, things started to get really muddy, which is why I think that Demetra's Ancient Astrology Volume 2 graphs are so valuable, right? Some significations will likely be very confusing, and they will overlap. So, for example, death, right, can be found in the 4th house, in the 7th house, in the 8th house, and in the 12th house, depending on who you ask and when you ask that question. I think over time, each astrologer kind of needs to find their own way of making an internal logic that works for their brain, for their experience, and based on their the kinds of people that they work with and the kinds of concerns that people come to you with, I think it's really important to test things out, to test out the significations in the space of consultations or talking with friends. In the question, I think, okay, so let me reread the question at this point, right? The first question was sometimes the house significations can feel random and difficult to intuit. So I want to speak to this concern about the houses being difficult to intuit, right? Hopefully, some of what I shared, especially in regards to thinking about them in pairs, can really help you. And also, I want to validate that it can take a while for intuition to kick in, because similar to learning signs and learning planets, you kind of need to integrate this information into your body, and you need to integrate it into how you talk to other people about astrology. And after a while, you will start to begin, and also, I should mention, continuing to learn, right? I would say, there are episodes out there, for example, from the astrology podcast that are extremely long episodes talking about different houses, right? And different house significations. And I think it's really worth investing some time or allowing yourself to just explore those resources, because the more you expose yourself intellectually, the more your body also starts to make connection, right? So I don't really separate. I don't vilify the intellect, right? I don't say, don't study all the books, don't study all the things, because I too study all the things. And to me, it's an ongoing process. Part of learning astrology is knowing that there's so much to learn that you cannot stop learning. And you don't have to if you don't want to. I would say really don't get encouraged or don't get discouraged, right? I encourage you to continue studying and to continue keeping at it. One assignment that I gave a student once that I found to be really helpful is for them to create artwork or some sort of physical representation, right? Whether that's poetry that they wrote or a picture of something that gave them a tangible physical representation of how each of the houses feel to them, right? And it seems to be a really valuable experience for the students. So I just want to throw that out there in case any of you listening may find that to be an interesting and exciting exercise to kind of dip into. Finally, I will say, see what resonates, see what makes sense in your brain and in your lived experiences. See what makes sense for the people that you talk to, right? Because that will most likely be the house significations that work for you. So, yes, from an academic perspective, I would definitely highly recommend, researching, learning, reading books that are hopefully going to really help with solidifying or parsing out this information. And then go out there, right? Play with this information. Don't be satisfied with just reading the book and then say, okay, I got it, right? Because clearly if you learn the entirety of, or at least so far, what we have and what we know as the entire canon of what can be learned, you will see that things change too. Different generations of astrologers, different lineage of astrologers have their own concerns and they shift the significations. So allow yourself to approach this as play and to continue playing. This is a question from Bridget. Aspects, by sign or by degree or both? First of all, fabulous question, Bridget. Thank you for asking that question. And also, this is a technical question, which requires a technical answer. And I believe that wherever you are in your astro journey, even if you just kind of let this wash over you, I think you will still find something very helpful from my answer. Or you will take away whatever you need to take away, and you can just trust that. First, I'm going to refine the question a little bit. I'm going to talk about this or share a response kind of from the perspective of either a birth chart, right, which is the arrangement of the planets and the stars when an individual was born, or /n, in terms of transit astrology, right? Meaning observing the perspective of the planets at the current moment in time, and then sort of relating it to the birth chart with the assumption that there will be some insights there to glean. The reason why I want to refine that question is because there are going to be other ways of using astrology, like electional astrology or horary, which I am not super well versed in. And so maybe from those perspectives, there will be other ways to answer this question. But my practice is really centered around natal astrology. And so I'm going to be speaking to it from that perspective, which also, because I know you, Bridget, I assume that you're also asking from that perspective. So first, I feel like it's important for me to start with a primer on aspects, right? To just kind of quickly share what aspects are all about. So if you have the option at this point to sit in front of a zodiac wheel, right, which you can just Google, if you can just Google like a zodiac wheel, that would be great, I think, because then you will have a little bit of a visual for you. Or if you're out there listening to this while you're commuting or whatever, which is always what I do anyway when I listen to podcasts, then you can just let this completely wash over you and let, whatever you need will stick to you and will speak to you. So first of all, what are aspects, right? Let me explain the definition of aspects. Aspects are essentially relationships between planets in an astrological horoscope or an astrological chart as we know it. Can be a birth chart, can be a chart of an event, or really anything. And generally, aspects are expressed as the angle degree that a planet makes to another point in the chart, right? So it can be a degree between one planet to another planet. It can be between one planet to an asteroid, or it can be between a planet and what we call an angle, right? Which is either an ascendant, descendant, midheaven, right? Or the IC. Or it can also be two calculated points. So for example, to the lunar nodes, right? Which is not like an actual celestial body. Okay, so there are many aspects, but in my practice, I mainly only use the 5 Ptolemaic aspects, right? So conjunction, which is anything kind of between 0 to 30 degrees, and then opposition, which is 180 degrees, trines, which are 120 degrees, squares, which are 90 degrees, and then sextiles, which are 60 degrees, right? And in astrology, we often consider that certain aspects are hard aspects and other aspects are soft aspects, right? Now, the word itself, like hard and soft, is a little bit weird. To me, it's open to interpretation and maybe it's a little bit confusing. But essentially, hard aspects, which are conjunctions, oppositions, and squares, are really relationships signified by hardship, conflicts, confusions, power struggles between the two different forces, right, that are in relationship. So my pop culture references are really not that amazing, but maybe think of like Batman and like the Joker, or like Kanye and like Pete Davidson, at least in 2022, right? Or like Trump and Hillary, just like forces that don't really gel well together, that don't have the best relationships. They're not exactly best buds, in the room. I also like to think of these hard aspects as signifying like really intense relationships, right? So, for example, think about like Romeo and Juliet, or like Jack and Rose from the Titanic, right? Like they clearly love each other, but their relationships are really marked by a lot of disturbances or like hardships, right? And then soft aspects represent relationships that are signified by excitement, ease, resonance, flow, collaboration. So maybe think about like Obama and Joe Biden, or like if you watch the 90s sitcom Charmed, which was actually my favorite TV show growing up. That's how the Charmed sisters appear to me, right? Like they are not always in agreement, but there's more of like this harmonious relationship and an awareness that if they work together, then something good will happen or will come out of it, right? It's not going to be this like shit show. Obviously, if you learn astrology within a course or if you're getting a reading from an astrologer, you're going to get a lot more subtlety than just kind of like the binary of like hard and soft, good and bad, right? And there's a lot there to explore. But for now, let's just suffice to say that some aspects are more like hard aspects, other aspects are soft aspects. And for me, I also use a bit of a mental shortcut, right, in terms of remembering the actual degrees. So for example, to some of you, this may be really interesting. And to some of you, this may be like just over my head, right? Trine sounds like 3 to me. So I basically calculate, 360, right, which is the whole circle of a zodiac divided by 3, which is going to be 120, right? So trines are 120 degrees. Squares sound like 4, so then 360 divided by 4, right, which is 90. So squares are 90 degrees. And then sextiles sounds like 6. So 360 divided by 6 is 60 degrees, right? Which really helps my Mercury and Pisces brain. So that's kind of what by degrees aspects are, right? Meaning you really calculate the actual degrees between 2 points or 2 planets or 2 things in the chart, right? Often different astrologers will use different orbs. So orbs are really, I kind of think of it as like margin of error, right? So let's take trines, for example, which are 120 degrees. If you use a 10-degree orb, then you will still consider, a relationships that's 110 degrees or 130 degree angle to still be a trine, right? And then another way to look at aspects is by sign. So this is really me explaining what Bridget's question was about, right? What does it mean to look at aspects by sign versus by degree, right? So by sign aspects, let me explain it by starting with the whole zodiac wheel, right? So if you look at the whole zodiac wheel, which nowadays is often represented in a circle, it's really 360 degrees, right? And then there are 12 signs. So each zodiac sign gets 30 degrees. So then you'll see that, for example, let's take the signs of Leo and Sagittarius, right? They form a trine with each other. How do we know this? Because the whole region of Leo in the chart is 30 degrees, right? And then the next sign over is Virgo, and then Libra, and then Scorpio. And then we get to Sag, right? So between Leo and Sag, there are 4 signs. And so 4 times 30 is 120. Well, kind of, right? It's imprecise because it depends on where the planets are at within the region of Leo and Sag. So sometimes maybe Venus is 0 degrees Leo, right? And then Mars is 29 degrees Sag, right? Which effectively, if you look at the by degree aspect, it would make them closer to 150 degrees than 120 degree. In which case, by sign, right, because Venus and Mars are still one in Leo and one in Sag, right, it's still a trine. By degree, it's not, right? Okay. So you with me? Hopefully, if you have not taken a primer astrology course, I just gave you a crash course there and you haven't fully fainted. I hope you're still here. Now, I'm going to actually get to Bridget's question. Okay, just took a little sip of water there. To me, the answer to this is really not very straightforward, right? First of all, I don't think there's really a right and wrong. I will first answer this from more of a theoretical point of view, right? In general, I've noticed that in my own practice, aspects that are by sign and by degree tend to be the most felt in someone's lived experience. So for example, my own chart. My moon is 18 degrees Gemini and my sun is 13 degrees Pisces. So if you use a 10-degree orb, right, it's both a square by sign and also by degree, right? So squares generally signify tension or like conflict or a need to maybe slow down a little bit because there's almost like this car crash kind of relationship between them, right? So if you think about squares or you think about a 90-degree angle, the first thing I often think about is like an intersection, right? Like a crossroads, like a traffic intersection. And so if 2 cars are coming in, one from, like one direction and then the other one coming in from another direction, and they're going both at the same speed and they didn't slow down and they didn't see the traffic lights, then they're just going to crash into each other, right? So to me, squares kind of have that vibe of like there's a lot of tension. If they don't slow down to figure out their disagreement, something's going to erupt. So this tension between my natal sun and my natal moon, which one can sort of interpret as my sense of spirit or soul's purpose versus my body or my circumstances, or kind of my sense of outward service versus self-care. it's always been like this tension has always been present in my own lived experience. And I find this to kind of be true at all times and all chapters of my life, regardless of what transit's going on at the moment. In certain periods, it may be more intense than others, but it's still present regardless of intensity. So aspects that are by sign, so that's just my way of saying that, aspects that are by sign and degree tend to be very intense, right? Or really deeply felt, even despite, whatever else is going on in the chart or in the person's life at the moment. However, there are going to be aspects that are by sign and not by degree, right? Or aspects that are by degree and not by sign. And what I have found in my own lived experience and some of the people that I work with is that they tend to be a little less obvious in general. It may require a bit more investigation or a bit more work to kind of unearth the subconscious ways that they tend to be playing out. But, this is a big but it doesn't mean that it cannot become important, especially when there's an important transit affecting at least one of the planets. So for example, let's say in my own chart, right, my moon and my Venus are not, it's trine by sign, but not by degree, right? And it's not really something that I see in my lived experience or I feel in my own body and my conscious awareness a whole lot. However, when Venus was transiting, when Saturn was transiting through my Venus, I felt the connection between Venus and the moon super strongly. And then once Saturn kind of passes by, I noticed that the intensity waned, and I don't think about it as much anymore. Now, let's look at more from like a practical or maybe even like philosophical point of view, right? I have a couple points to make here. The first one is that each astrological tradition is different, right? So this has a lot to do with which house system you're currently using. So if you are working on, if you're working with by sign aspect, for example, to me, it makes a whole lot of sense when you're using whole sign system, right? So with whole sign, each house is represented by one sign, right? So in this case, it really makes a lot of sense that for someone, for example, if someone is a Leo rising, right? Using a previous example, if they have Venus in 0 degree Leo and Mars in 29 degree Sag, then that Venus will be on their first house and Mars will be on their fifth house, right? So in this case, you can see that not only is there a by sign significance that you can kind of speak to or reflect on because Sag and Leo are both fire signs, but there's also a connection, right, between the first house and the fifth house, which cannot be ignored and also factors into how you would consider delineating a chart. However, if you use, let's say, like Placidus or Porphyry, the bi-house aspect may not be preserved, right? Because maybe in that case, Venus, right, in 0 degree Leo might be in someone's first house, but then that Mars in 29 degree Sag may be in that person's sixth house, right? So the bi-house aspect may not be preserved. And so unless, someone is a very early degree on their rising sign, you'll probably find a little bit of a deviation. And so that may play into whether you decide to talk about that by sign aspect or not, right? Depending on what insights you are trying to share with that person. So an additional note is that there is a branch of astrology, a lineage called archetypal astrology, which really grew out of Rick Tarnas's incredible work, Cosmos and Psyche. And within archetypal astrology, aspects are really at the forefront of chart delineation. So in archetypal astrology, or a lot of the archetypal astrologers that I know almost don't really use signs that much, at least at first, right? they may introduce the archetypes of signs a little bit later, but the focus is really on like the aspects between different planets. And so within this tradition or lineage, I would say that by degree aspects are primary, right? Because they don't even really consider signs. And, zooming out even further, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here because this doesn't necessarily just speak to aspects, but maybe speaks to astrology in general. To me, astrology is really a system, right? And systems are tools or compendium or consolidations that attempt to organize insights and findings to the underlying questions that sort of, lie at the heart of the inquirer, right? So systems are built upon, ponderings, experimentations, findings that are unique to each lineage, depending on the question that they're trying to answer, right? So I think astrological techniques are similar too. A lot of them didn't just grow. It's not just like, oh, let's just look at this technique, right? But it's more like we've been observing like these astrologers, both in ancient times and modern times, have noticed certain patterns in their own practice, in their own lives, in the lives of the people that they read for. And so they begin to consolidate that knowledge, those findings, into a specific system, right? To make it easier for them to then transfer that knowledge maybe to the next astrologer, to their students, or to even just share it and make it something that can be tangible for the people that they read for. So each tradition kind of has their own unique concerns, perspectives, questions that they're trying to answer. And to me, at best, it's illuminating, it's revelatory to kind of investigate what is at the heart of each tradition. And at worst, it's just utterly fascinating, even if I don't resonate with the questions or the answers that they come up with, right? So I don't think you can ever really go wrong going around learning different traditions, talking to different astrologers, investigating it just a little bit deeper. To me, it's that pursuit is so satisfying, right? And it opens up portals for kind of deeper connections and more flow of inspiration. Once you get a sense of what each tradition is trying to answer or is attempting to uncover, then you'll probably have a better sense of why they use certain techniques and whether it makes sense for you to use the same techniques too within your practice. So that's to kind of answer the question from a lineage or a tradition perspective. Now, another piece that I will add is that each astrologer is totally different, right? Each astrologer's practice is going to be unique to their own. So truly, you kind of have to decide which techniques are going to work for you in your practice at this moment in time, right? For me, in general, I try to make sure of two things, right? A, that I trust my intuitive sense kind of first and foremost with regards to the topics and the archetypes that are alive and important to the person that I'm reading for. And B, that I use the chart primarily as a tool to ground the information or the events or the patterns that I'm seeing in my own life or in my students or my clients, rather than trying to figure out who they are using their chart. I hope that makes sense. In other words, I use the chart as a tool to ground information, right? And a treasure trove of creative solutions. I don't use the chart as a tool for data mining, and I don't recommend that either. I'm going to speak more on this later. There's another question, maybe it's going to be on this episode or a separate episode about how I read charts that will kind of illuminate this. So if you find this point interesting, I definitely recommend checking out my response to the other question. And so essentially, for this question, right, if something really speaks to me, I'm going to mention it. If it doesn't speak to me in the moment, or my intuition kind of tells me it's not relevant, then I've been learning to really trust that it's either not for this particular consult or not for this person, and that's okay. So for you, Bridget, I have a bit of an additional homework if you're listening to this. What I think is interesting to check out too is the idea that certain aspects are separating, exact, or applying, right? If I recall correctly, this is more of a horary technique, but what I found is that it's really helpful to use this as a tool to feel into whether an aspect is felt strongly or not. So if your question or the underlying question behind your question is how do we use aspects in our practice in a way that will make the reading really hit for the person we're reading for, then I think this technique of really trying to figure out, separating, exact, applying aspects, which is really not that hard, it gives you a little bit of an extra nuance to this discussion around aspects. Okay, so that is a whole encyclopedia there, mini little encyclopedia on aspects, and I hope that's helpful for you. This question is from the lovely Rebecca. More on stelliums, please. All right, Rebecca, here you go. So, stelliums are basically when 3 or more planets are in one house or in one sign or place within a relatively narrow degree, right? Which is about 30 degrees. So the definition, the real or the exact definition of stellium to me really vary from astrologer to astrologer, from one tradition or one school of thought to another. Not to mention the fact that people use different rules for aspects and different house systems, right? All of that really is to say that a simple question, that is, what are stelliums and how can we interpret them? Which I am assuming is your question, Rebecca, suddenly becomes a really complicated answer. Welcome to astrology. So some people believe that it's not a stellium unless there are 3 planets that are, the 3 planets are personal planets, right? Which are Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn. I personally still call it a stellium, even when the 3 or more planets are outer planets, or even Chiron, right? Which is an asteroid. Now, the other asteroids, like the goddess asteroids and things like that, I don't know. I don't know if I would consider, 3 goddess asteroids to be a stellium. Intuitively, at this point in my practice, I kind of resist calling it a stellium, not because I don't think asteroids are valid or influential, but rather because, I don't know, it starts to get a little, it's just a little too much, right? You can start seeing that there are stelliums everywhere and it becomes confusing what's significant and what's not significant. I still haven't fully made up my mind on whether clumps of asteroids are stelliums. I think I need a little bit more time to really figure that out. So maybe ask me this question again in 5 years. So I think in a lot of modern astrological approaches or schools or lineages focus more on kind of like the macro shapes, right? Like how certain planets clump together or certain shapes that you see overall in the chart. And for me personally, having learned some traditional astrology, specifically Hellenistic, even though, to be very clear, I am not a straight up Hellenistic astrologer, I feel like having learned these older traditions of astrology, what I've noticed is, when I start incorporating the way to look at the system from these older, more ancient traditions, stelliums are kind of seen through a different lens, right? Like maybe it's slightly less ominous, or maybe there's like a little less gravity on like seeing stellium. In traditional astrology, I would say the focus is way more on the ruler of each house and the condition of that ruler, right? So, for example, let's say my fifth house of creativity and romance is ruled by Capricorn. And so Capricorn is a planet or is a sign that is ruled by Saturn, right? And my Saturn is also in Capricorn in the fifth house. So that to me gives a certain gravity or tells me that the condition and the experience of my fifth house, pretty tellingly, right? Because it's in a sign that's ruled by Saturn, and then Saturn is in that house, right? And then for me also, I have a Mars that is in Capricorn too, right next to Saturn. So then we call that a Mars that is exalted in Capricorn. So as you can see, in traditional astrology, I guess to completely oversimplify, right? We kind of think about it more in terms of like, okay, there's this place that is the house, right? What does this place look like, right? What is the temperature and the landscape of this place, which is the sign? And then who is the boss of that sign, right? Or like who does that sign answer to? And then we look at the ruler of that sign. And so, as you can see, this kind of way of thinking, right, makes stellium a little bit less of a thing, at least in my experience. Like it's still there, but the gravity placed upon the stellium kind of fades more into the background because you're maybe more focused on a slightly different line of reasoning. I hope I'm explaining that well. I will say that on a felt sense, right? So now I'm moving away from like seeing stelliums from a technical perspective and more into the feeling sense of it. To me, stelliums feel like a lot, Somewhere in this whole Q&A series, I answered a question on aspects which you may want to listen to just for completeness, but I feel like stelliums really double or triple down on the significations of an aspect that we call conjunctions, right? Because technically that's exactly what stelliums are, right? Like stelliums are basically a bunch of planets conjoin each other. So it's kind of like a maxi conjunction, sort of. So if two planets are conjoin each other, you can kind of think of them as like a crowded stage full of divas, right? So if anybody watched the Divas live show from VH1 in the 90s, I may be totally dating myself here, but that's what conjunctions feel like to me, or like, those Marvel movies that just has one too many superheroes. That is kind of how stelliums can feel like, because it's like an overcrowded house. Like there are way too many superheroes in this area of life. It's like a bunch of people who are so used to being so great on their own, and then suddenly you bring them on to the same stage, and then it kind of becomes a very volatile situation. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen that video of the first Divas Live where Aretha Franklin, who is, by the way, an Aries sun, and then Celine Dion, who is also an Aries sun, kind of had this moment, of like out riffing each other. Yeah, like sometimes it can be totally incredible, or it can kind of be the fucking worst, So, kind of seeing these divas like one-upping each other with the vocal runs and stuff, like to me, that's the felt sense of how stelliums can feel like, In general, the house that has a stellium becomes extremely important to the person. So to go back to my question, or to my earlier illustration, right? An example about my own stellium in the fifth house of creativity. I have Saturn, Mars, Uranus, and Neptune in Capricorn in the fifth house. And I talk all the time about creativity, whether I like it or not. Even long after I hang up the official title of being a quote unquote professional artist, I still see all that I do as art, right? I still see my life as my art. I still see each reading and each time I teach as an artwork on some level. Everything to me kind of goes back to the concerns of that fifth house of creativity, of art, of unique self-expression. With regards to the signs, I think it kind of depends, right? I don't know if I think of myself as a very Capricorn person. I don't know. Maybe those of you who know me can kind of speak more to this, but I definitely see that my busy fifth house, ruled by the Capricorn energy, is very intense, right? I put a shitload of time on my art, whatever that art is within that period of time, right? And I can sometimes have this superhuman capacity to continue churning out stuff. At the same time, I also deal with a ton of like inner critic stuff, right? And it's almost interesting or paradoxical that sometimes I feel like the best way for me to work on my inner critic is to actually make more art, because then I'm like kind of like, whoa, I can't believe all the stuff that I've done. And then that inner critic is immediately toned down, right? So yeah, all that is to say, notice that not all stelliums are created equal, right? In my case, Saturn, the ruler of Capricorn, is in domicile, right? Because in my chart is in Capricorn and Mars is exalted in Capricorn. So I see this as, showing up in how I have a lot of durability, and I can really be very action oriented in how I show up to my creative life. It's extremely alive, it's extremely structured, and there's a healthy dose of overworking and inner critic situation as well. So let's say I have a different chart, right? And I have Saturn there, and then instead of being conjoined by Mars, let's say Saturn is conjoined by my moon, which, if you know traditional astrology, we call the moon to be in detriment in Capricorn, right? And I think this is where, really investing time and energy to study in foundational astrological courses, especially one that speaks about the dignity scheme, right, can really help you, because the word detriment is loaded, right? And maybe a lot of things come up in your mind right now about what that word means. But I think studying deeper and continuing to use those terms is really important, because we can honor the tradition and also simultaneously change how we relate to it, right? Or really try to understand it from the perspective of the culture from where it comes from. Anyways, that's a bit of an aside, but let's say I still have my Saturn in Capricorn, and then instead of having Mars, which is exalted in Capricorn, conjoin that Saturn, I instead have the moon that is in detriment in Capricorn, right? Then maybe the experience is more like I'm hard on myself, and I may really struggle with feeling safety and security even if I work really hard, right? Like maybe I know how to create durable structures with Saturn being in Capricorn, but with the moon being in Capricorn there, maybe there's this added sense of brittleness, that I can be really resistant to ever feeling satisfied, even when I've done a really fabulous job at creating structures and working really, really hard. So I just use myself as an example, and hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of demonstration of how I structure or how I see stelliums in my own practice, right? Because to me, I don't think all stelliums are the same. And it really doesn't feel the same to me. Like when I see a stellium in Venus, where maybe like there's Mars there, which is in detriment, what I meant is not Venus. What I meant is Libra, right? If I see a stellium in Libra and then I see Mars as being part of that stellium versus maybe seeing Saturn being there, because Saturn is exalted in Libra, right? Whereas Mars is in detriment in Libra. That will have very different flavor, in my opinion. So it's a bit complicated. I think it's on a case-by-case basis. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I actually don't use stellium super much or super often unless someone brings it up in a consult, and then we can maybe talk about it. In fact, I would say these days I often don't bring up aspects in general unless I'm talking with someone who is studying astrology or curious about studying astrology, because I tend to find that talking about aspects can be a little jarring to people who don't study astrology at all. I'm not really sure why. Maybe it kind of takes them out of the ability to receive information intuitively, or, with a more creative, softer, more receptive part of their brain. And it kind of, puts them in this very analytical, like, I have to figure this out mode. Like, what is a 60-degree angle, right? It's really strange, so I try to be super careful about talking about aspects in general. Hopefully that is an interesting answer to you, Rebecca, and to anybody who is interested in learning more about stelliums. All right, I hope that you found this episode to be interesting, thought-provoking, helpful to you. As a reminder, there are a bunch of other Q&A episodes around this episode, really from episode 26 to 31. So if you want to hear me talk more about different questions that people submitted, feel free to really find a topic that's interesting to you. And if you're resonating with this episode, definitely check out Astrology as Praxis. It's going to be a year-long journey of learning astrology, integrating astrology, understanding both yourself and the world around you using astrology as a framework for, really practicing what it means to be human. Britton and I would love to see you in the container if you resonate with our voices. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate, review this podcast, and if you're on Apple, I would love to receive your review. Something new that I am currently creating is some content that I will share with you as a gift if you write some reviews. So if you do write reviews, please take a screenshot before you submit it and then send it to me on healingthespiritpodcast@gmail.com. And then I will get back to you when the bonuses are ready. Just want to say that this is a practice that I find inspiring from one of my teachers, Sabrina Monarch. So I'm like, I want to do the same too. And it will be a totally different content, obviously. But just naming Sabrina as my inspiration for reciprocity. Until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself. And I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening.